After several weeks of Lent, which tends to be more somber, our readings and even our psalm today is much more upbeat. Easter is coming. This passage is one of the most well-known passages, short passages in the Gospels. And yet, and this is something I didn't know before I was doing my reading and research for today, in many Bibles, it is only a footnote. The earliest manuscripts of John's Gospel do not include this passage. Some biblical scholars believe it was left out because it made Jesus look a little bit too soft on sin. Others thought it was elsewhere and moved and they weren't sure where it belonged. Some think it was just written afterwards and inserted. But most scholars agree it seems authentic Jesus, an authentic representation of Jesus. This particular passage, like many passages in the Gospels, make it clear that Jesus doesn't really get too upset with sinners. He is frequently quite upset with people who don't think they are sinners and who like to accuse others of being sinners. What we observed in the scribes and the Pharisees, the religious leaders of the time, and perhaps we recognize in ourselves sometimes, is the inclination to accuse others. Did you know that the word Satan actually means accuser? When we blame or accuse, we probably are not feeling very good about ourselves. Because what we don't like in ourselves, that which is hard for us to forgive in ourselves, we tend to project onto other people. It's human nature. My Franciscan brother, Richard Rohr, who many of you know I quote very often in my homilies, he uses the metaphor of a river to describe God's love. And that when we know and trust the river, when we're confident of God's infinite love, when we can go with the flow of the river, even though it's sometimes scary, we know we are a child of God. We know we are His beloved. And only when we know this in our hearts can we recognize the belovedness in other people. When we try to control the river or push the river because of our fears or our hurts, we tend to judge things and others in a narrow way. We aren't trusting the love and the grace of the divine. And today's gospel exemplifies that. Jesus is in the temple teaching. The religious leaders then bring forth a woman to accuse her of the sin of adultery. Note that it's only the woman who is accused. And we all know it takes two to tango. Just saying. After they accuse her, humiliating and shaming her, we hear in the text that the Pharisees and scribes bring her to Jesus in order to test him. So it's really not for justice. It's to test him and trap him. Because either way Jesus goes with his answer to their question, it's a problem. If he enforces the existing law, it goes against everything he's been teaching. And if he doesn't, then he's not following the law of Moses. I wish I knew what Jesus was scribbling in the sand. Don't you? I mean, it's mentioned twice. And it's the only time in Scripture where it says Jesus wrote something. What was it? Was it a list of names? Maybe names of people those Pharisees and scribes had committed sins with. Maybe it was a list of sins, of their sins. Random doodles because he was just disgusted with what they were doing or trying to distract the crowd. I wonder, and I wish I knew, but it really doesn't matter. Let any one of you who is without sin cast the first stone, he then says. And the gospel notes that it was the oldest the elders of the crowd had left first. And one by one, they dropped their stones and walked away until no one remained. Woman, where are they? Jesus asks. Has no one condemned you? No, sir, she says. But neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. Go and sin no more. That's one of only 2 times in the recorded ministry of Jesus where he says, go and sin no more. And I don't believe for a second that he expected the woman to do such a thing. She was a human. She's going to make another mistake. She's going to fail again. He knew she was not so different than the religious leaders that surrounded her. Not so different from you and me. We will always be pulled out of the flow of God's love and grace. But perhaps Jesus hopes she and we might think twice before casting our own stones. Perhaps the lesson is that we must always balance the law and compassion and love for the person. A person who we must recognize is made in the image and likeness of God. It's easy to forget that part, the compassion and love part. The people in those days, with their codes and rules regulating everything from the fibers in their clothes to the people they could touch, it seems odd to us. But we have our own codes. People we label who don't fit in. Conditions we place on God's grace. Theological checklists for receiving sacraments. Transgressions, real or imagined, that we take very, very seriously because we think they are much more severe than our own transgressions. Go and sin no more, Jesus says. Trust the river. When we trust in God's love and grace and compassion, his love and grace and compassion for us, we become his love and his compassion